It's a great pleasure to be here. I've known through one of my students, who I will mention later in my talk, about this project here, which I think is absolutely admirable. And I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm very grateful to Vivek for orchestrating this. I would, though, like to say it's a rather daunting thing for me. This is not, as it were, a natural focus of my work. And moreover, one of the reasons that Vivek got in touch with me was because 20 years ago or so, I had written about liberation technology, but I have to say I wrote about it in an ironic term. I was thinking of liberation theology and saying how people, info enthusiasts, as we used to call them in those days, will look on information and information technology as inherently liberating. So I will, in part, go back in time to that work and say what I was thinking about then. But one thing I want to do before I get going, and in some ways it's a sign that although I've been in California for 30 years, the Englishman hasn't left me, and that is begin, because of this daunting prospect, with a series of apologies. You will probably know, many of you, that the Englishmen of a certain class have a strange habit that if you stand on their toe or drop coffee on their lap or elbow them, they will apologize to you and say, oh, terribly sorry, before it all begins. And there is luckily, much as I miss her, she is not here today, but my wife used occasionally to come to my talks, and afterwards she would have the account of how many apologies I had given in the state. So now I'm just going to be up front and apologize. And there are a few things in the context of this talk that quite seriously I do want to apologize. One is that of late, a lot of my work has been historical. And I know many of you are looking at contemporary work and looking to the future. As I said, the reason I'm here is for something I wrote 20 years ago. So bringing in history, I've tried to keep it out, but I realize as I looked at my slides, it keeps creeping in. To give you a sense of my own anxiety about that, I actually teach a course at Berkeley called History of Information. And at the end of every semester, you, of course, ask the students what they liked about the course. And one of my favorite one-word answers for a course called History of Information was, you've sort of got a feeling if somebody who's been with you for 15 weeks and is objecting to the fact that the course was about history, yet it was called History of Information, but that sense that we live in an entirely different age, that the past is off, that the history has nothing to tell us, I think worked very hard in battles with how we think of information, which is one of the things I want to talk about today. A second issue is that my work tends to be highly theoretical. And I realize I'm talking to a lot of people who are either engaged in practical work or who are interested in hoping to do something practical in the world, and at times can see theoretical work as almost a luxury. I will, to talk about some empirical work, as I say, draw on my students, because they tend to do it and I don't. But in some ways, I just need to apologize in advance for that. And third, the one in some ways that worries me most in all of this, given in particular my patrician colonial accent, is that there is a tendency that it might look a little condescending in what I say. I am aware of that up front, and certainly please push back. I have, as I say, I have an enormous amount of admiration for the sort of work that is associated with this center. But I want to, as I was trying to do when I coined the phrase, well, no, I cannot say I coined it, because Vivek actually tells me that George Bush Sr. coined the phrase liberation technology. But when I was bringing it up, it was against a certain kind of enthusiasm, and it's partly in that context that I want to talk today. Emphasizing the historical, as I shall be, let me begin with, in a way, what's my theme, and here I'm going to go back almost 200 years to a somewhat impenetrable piece of prose, which talks about the mirrors of shadows which look at the future. So it's about people who look to the future and show us what the future looks like. The people who in some ways will sing us into battle to take on the future. The people who can influence the public without themselves being influenced or corrupt. And these are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. This, in fact, is not talking about anything we would expect. It was a defense of poetry. It's the last line of Shelley's Defense of Poetry. And he saw poets in the 19th century as the unacknowledged. Well, I want to suggest now that in many ways technologists are becoming the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In some ways there is a huge amount of the world which simply does not and cannot understand the implications of what those who live in the world of information technology are designing. And that almost by default makes people who work in this area and who have significant effects legislators of a strange kind. And I want to bring awareness in some of my recent work to this and what the implications are. Because being a legislator, as perhaps we know from our recent elections, is an odd and complex process, some of which has very strange moral overtones. The legislative power, well, we've seen it, for instance, in Lessig. Larry Lessig's famous book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, very much says, look, we talk about two kinds of code, legal code and software code, but they seem very different, but perhaps they're not. In some ways, the way code is being written is to prescribe and limit and control people's behavior. And as we write code, however much we may want to go into the world and make this beneficial, we are in some ways being prescriptive as we do it. Now, we see it in certain institutions, clearly. If we look at the major technology companies, we know that they have remarkably prescriptive codes to which people tend to be surprisingly compliant and obedient, in part perhaps because of the benefits they get, and in part because they may not simply understand the implications of their conformity to rules that are simply built within these various kinds of social network or computer systems. Of course, coming up next to that is slightly more worrying forms of very serious coders who of late we have learned are very much trying to control, monitor our behavior as we might think of them as legislative, with a lot of very young aspiring technologists and some people who very much believed that they had both the right and the obligation to do what they're doing. Just aside, one of the things that has intrigued me as being as coming from Europe to America is that in general, I find Americans have, until recently at least, their strongest suspicion has been of the government. And they tend to look on corporations as relatively benign. You go to Europe, you get almost the reverse effect. People are remarkably complacent about government and look on corporations as relatively benign. The Snowden revelations have in some ways thrown that into turmoil. We might just throw in today's news, I'm afraid, that we find GCHQ, which is even creepier than the NSA, has been spying on lawyers and somehow justifying that. So I would suggest that there is enormous kinds of proxy legislative power in this kind of code that we have to think about. And it brings up all sorts of questions about having power without responsibility, Kipling's famous line. And also those very tricky questions about what you can do versus what you should do and how we look at those obligations. Okay, so that in some way is the pitch that I want to make, that we are, as we engage with the world, becoming these unacknowledged legislators, and we need to think about both kinds of code, what we mean by the legal code as well as the computer code as we write code. Now, part of what I do is think about information itself, and I want to talk a little today about information and its challenges. And I want to sort of suggest some information assumptions. I mean, one is this very easy assumption we make, or connection between information and freedom of one sort or another. I mean, when Stuart Brand said information wants to be free, he was also saying at the same time, and did say that information wants to be expensive. I mean, he had that notion of freedom, the free as in beer notion, as Richard Sorworth said. But we have somehow come to believe that, I think, that information has an almost inherent and interesting connection with freedom. And that, I mean, it's very odd to think of information as something, A, that has desires, as something that wants, and B, that is capable of freedom. but yet this line is repeated again and again. But more the idea that information is also a means to other people's freedom, and that in providing information, we are addressing important things about how people can be free in political questions. And we are, but we need to think perhaps a little more of them at times. Another is that information is in many ways seen as sufficient. I'm being a little unkind here to the economist Paul Romer, but he, in looking at development, wrote what to me is a very strange paper called The Ideas Gap. And in that argument he said, look, if we look at the developing and the developed world, what we used to have to do in the part, the difference between us was that we had material things that in some ways we had to either allow them to produce or export to them, and that was enormously cumbersome and burdensome. But now the gap is not a gap of things, it's simply a gap of ideas. And all we need to do is spread our ideas to the developing world, and equality will bloom within the world. And that, I think, does a couple of things for me. One is it says, well, we can sort of underestimate quite how much work information can do. The other is, I think we want to say, well, look, if we've put the information and the ideas out, our hands are clean. It's their fault if they didn't bother to use them. And so we shed our responsibility very easily in ideas like that. A third idea which I've become more interested in of late, and I was confessing to Vivek, I spent most of my recent time working in the 18th century, is an idea that grows there but that we still have, is the determining character of information. That information, if provided, has predictable and necessary effects. It's a quotation I find particularly interesting, that the press ought to supply the people with all the important information, give them fair and full information, and they will do the thing that is right. And it has enormous faith in the people and enormous faith in information, simply as the one thing people need in order for the political world to reorganize itself. Now that was in fact said by a strange chap called Vicesimus Knox, who wrote that in 1794, sorry. But yet somehow I think people would be quite happy in some areas with that phrase today. And so I think that kind of faith in information and its efficacy, and therefore with the technology behind it, that alone will simply reform many of the world's problems, is something that I think we need to be increasingly aware of. Let me make some suggestions about, as I would say, where we go wrong. And the first thing I would call in my phrase is wishing on information. That is, we look at information and just wish that it will do for us the things that we desire for the world and its reformation. One of the earliest progenitors of this is Marshall McLuhan, who seems to have coined the phrase of the age of information 50 years ago this year and said, look, what will it'll do? It'll cause enormous structural changes in mankind, a totally new environment, it'll abolish space and time, the final phase of the extensious man, the single consciousness, the global village. We will become one. We will think alike. We will live in harmony. It was an extraordinary projection of the world. One of the strange things about it is that if you look in most places for where this notion that we are the age of information comes from, it seems to come from here in McLuhan. In fact, it comes from my old friend Vicesimus Knox, who in 1778 said, this is the age of information. So I want to suggest that both the idea we live in an age of information and that it is determining has been with us for a very long time, and that we still need to be cautious about it. So there's one thing we want to think about. Another then is, I would say, where we go wrong too. If we wish on information, I think even more profoundly, we wish on technology. We look at technology and just hope, pray, or believe that it will fulfill our aspirations for a better world. And in some sense, that's what McLuhan is doing. My example from this is actually drawn from my work on trademarks for this, is a remarkable, I was actually in the French intellectual property archives. This was a patent claim. I won't embarrass you with my French pronunciation, but the claim for this technology is going to be one that will bring the world together, that distance will disappear, and the whole world will, in a sense, be one. Here's McLuhan all over again. The bid was actually made in 1791. I don't know if you want to guess what the technology is, but to save you the anxiety, it was that. Now, the idea is we have a new technology. France at the time was just going through a revolution. It was highly fragmented. We have a new technology that seems enormously powerful. We say, this is going to unite the country. And that theme, which of course we saw in McLuhan, of abolishing space and time, goes back to the early 18th century, and is, as soon as the line of sight telegraph comes along, someone says, this will annihilate space and time. The cross-continental railway, this will unite space and time. The telegraph, the international telegraph, the telephone, then the airplane. Every time a technology comes along, we say, this is going to annihilate space and time. It seems repeatedly, every new technology comes along, we project onto it our hopes for society. Communication theorist James Carey actually has a very nice account about why this is particularly prevalent in America. And he says, we grow up, in a sense, in that Tocqueville view that politics is part of a town meeting where people come together and, as this Rockwell painting shows, stand up and lead us into believing, understanding each other, coming to terms and voting. And that's all very well until you have a country that's 3,000 miles across and has 300 million people. And suddenly all the foundations of our ideas of democracy are put under this enormous stress. And again, we saw this week that question, could we possibly all come together and think alike? But each technology, we believe, is going to do this for us. If that is a contradiction in our political form, we look to technology once again to liberate us from the position we're in. So that's one concern I have about technology and information, is that we just project our wishes onto them. And that's very hard for any designer at all, to be just have us say, no, this is going to solve our problems. A second place I think that we go wrong is redefining things in terms of information. My image here is that the old line that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To a man with information technology, or a woman with information technology, as their means, their tools, we start to put all kinds of problems into the terms of information. So we redefine. Here is one particular case that intrigued me, again a rather old one. IBM put out a whole series of advertisements in the 1990s that I went to war with them about, called IBM Solutions for a Small Planet. And it's just beautiful. It was wonderfully shot in, these are stills from it, in a vineyard in Tuscany. And the old man is walking through the vines with his granddaughter. And with a wonderful reversal of roles, he turns to her and says, well, I finally finished my doctoral thesis. And she says, way to go, Gramps. Yeah, he says, I did my research at Indiana University. Indiana, heavens help me. Yeah, IBM took the school's library and digitized it so I could access it over the internet. You know, it's a great time to be alive. And it was a set of wonderful, very heavily produced, moving stories like this, but you pause and think about them. I mean, one is it has now defined education, and perhaps some of the trickiest aspects of education, getting a doctoral thesis, as simply having access to a library. And it defines the library as something that simply can be digitized by IBM. I actually wrote to Indiana and said, have you digitized your library? Well, they digitized a little bit of the music library. So we have a Tuscan farmer who wants to study Louisiana music and get a degree in that, you know, because all that Italian music isn't worth studying. But the other aspect of that, and so in fact, I think I was to some extent contributed to IBM being shamed enough to take this advertisement off the air. But one of the aspects of it that I think is worrying is that, look, if that is all it takes to get sufficient education to be able to take on the world, well, what does that say about all those bums in East Palo Alto? They can't even be bothered to walk up the road here, and here's this Tuscan farm. Or all those people in West Berkeley who just won't come up to the campus and use those books. Or all the people in Morningside Heights who won't climb up to Columbia. It's their fault, because really it's just that easy. And once you say information, that education and information are simply matters of one transferring the other, you again, as I've suggested, can very quickly say, well, we know how to define solutions, and equally, once we install those solutions, our hands are clean. We have no obligation to people anymore. So what I want to suggest is that there are some, and let me stay a little bit for the moment with education, unassailable assumptions that we just think are inherently good. And these are the things that are not only inherently good, but that tech will promote their inherently good ends. And the useful thing about that is that we can say, so if I work there, I don't really have to examine my conscience. If I go to work as a quant on Wall Street, well, I might have to look at myself. But if I go to work in some areas like education, then there's no problem at all. I am doing good work. And so we see remarkable things like the one laptop per child come out and simply say, look, spread this around and the problems of the world are solved. Negroponte remarkably said, you don't even have to do any research on this. You don't have to set up a pilot project to test laptops and learning. The fact that someone in the room would say the impact is unclear is to me amazing, unbelievable. So we just know A, information, and B, the technology, and C, education are just inherently good, and there's no reason to ask any questions. And again, I think that's the way in which we become naive, unacknowledged legislators of mankind. And this, the one laptop per child program, was enormously influential, though intriguingly recently it has come under some analysis that he predicted in 2005 that there would be 100 to 150 million laptops. And in fact, he was out by a couple of orders of magnitude. But the assumption was one that so many people nodded and said, that's what development needs, that's how we will solve the problems. There's nothing else these kids need except that one laptop per child. Don't put your money into that. Education's a good thing to go. And one of the intriguing things is if you look at education, if you look at foundational support and the number of foundations, so many of them are given over to education. And I think one reason is because it's just you don't have to defend it. If you're doing education, you're doing a good thing. This idea that it can solve all the problems, again, the historian in me would like to say is that we can kind of see it has early antecedents. This is a particularly enjoyable picture from the end of the 19th century of how technology will change the nature of education. So what I want to say with caution, but is that one of the tricky things when we work in an area of technology is the assumption that good intentions are going to be all that we need for justification. And as we all know, in a way, the famous saying that it's the road to hell that is paved with good intentions. And just staying for the moment in the area of education, I particularly moved early on, years ago, reading this book that's now 30 years old or more, by Paul Willis called Learning to Labor, partly because it's about the English educational system. And he gives an account, he did a long-term study of a high school in Birmingham, and what he said, as the subtitle said, it's how working class kids get working class jobs. And what's depressing about that is those schools are full of people who are enormously good-willed, have enormously good intentions. Their goal is to overthrow the English class system, and yet what they end up doing is reproducing that very system. And that's one of the worrying things when we go sort of wide-eyed into some idea that liberation is simply in the hands of us and our technology. We see sort of more recent versions of that, how in Murakawa's interesting book, of how it's liberals in some sense that led to the extraordinary rates of imprisonment in this country, that just because they had good intentions isn't in its way enough. Okay, so that's a theme that I don't think will be unfamiliar to you, and so I'm sorry if I'm hacking it to death. I want now, because I am lacking in some ways in my own work in this area, to look at some work of students that I have worked with, which I have found immensely insightful in this world. I should make absolutely clear that I am not speaking on their behalf, and they may not read their own work how I read it. I should also say I'm not trying to say that I taught them all this, so it must be good. In fact, to the opposite point in many ways, I've learned much more from them, I'm sure, than they've ever learned from me. One, to stay with education, is an interesting book called The Cutting Edge of Fun by Christo Sims, who now teaches at UCSD, and his book will be coming out from Princeton in a year or so. He looked at at a school that had been funded, I think, by MacArthur money in New York, and the idea was that if we not only built the whole syllabus around computers, but in fact built it around games and gaming. And so to explore physics, you built games that explored physics concepts, and to explore, et cetera, that this would be an enormously transformative kind of information. So a lot of money was put in school. A lot of very young idealist teachers went into that school to push this goal. They drew kids from all over New York. They looked to make sure that there was a cross-section of races, a cross-section of class and financial backgrounds. And they started off with enormous enthusiasm that now finally we can really reform education in such a way that it can transform society, because education is always looked on as one of the most transformative tools in society. He was there for 2 years, and what he discovered by the end of the second year was that nearly all the kids of non-white racial origins had been elbowed out of the school. They'd been elbowed out in part by extraordinary efforts on the part of the parents of the white middle-class kids, who were young techies from New York, who suddenly saw the behavior of other kids as disruptive, and who also saw their enormous power over these, with their PhDs, and they're working for Google and for high-tech companies, over the teachers. And slowly they began to make the school more and more both favor the conventional syllabus, because they wanted their kids to be sure of getting into schools like Stanford and Berkeley. They wanted to make sure that that disruptive behavior of those kids in the back row didn't disturb their kids, and so they eased them out of the school. And within 2 years, this was evolved into something that looked like a very conventional old school, despite the very best wishes not only of the way it was funded, but also of the very people working in the system who were there to think that they could transform the system. So I found it a remarkable finding. I put it in contrast to something like Richard Florida's Rise of the Creative Class, because in some ways it was the very creative class that in many ways was the worrying agent in this. Another example, I think, is by, some of you may know, Janaki Srinivasan, who graduated about 2 years ago from Berkeley, wrote a book called The Political Life of Information. And she had looked at about 4 different projects, including the right to information law, but also information kiosks and other kinds, of the way in which information was constantly being called upon as the way in which to solve the problems of the Indian state. What was intriguing about it was, if you looked at these different groups, you suddenly discovered that each of them had a very different idea of A, what information was, and B, how it would work. There was an enormous market view of this, that what people wanted was price information, to know what markets were functioning. Then there was the right to information laws, where people want to say, well, what we want is information about how the government is working. And so and those have very different implications for what we say information and information technology is the salvation of the system. So in that sort of study, we suddenly start to say, well, when people invoke information as necessary part of liberation and try to build technology for that, they're already building in all sorts of assumptions about how the system will work. She did more recent work with a colleague of mine looking at a very famous, again, informational case of Richard Jensen's The Digital Provide, who looked at the Kerala fishermen and said, if we just give them cell phones, again, all we need is one technology, that will solve their problems. They will now have market information, and they will be able to fish and sell with extraordinary efficiency. Because lurking behind an awful lot of this are market summaries of homeostasis, growing in markets as the invisible hand works to even everything out. In fact, they went back and looked, and with all admiration for his work, saw that it was far more complicated than that, because local conventions, local cultures, local obligations, even different kinds of fish make such a simple assumption enormously problematic. But it's one, and Jensen has had enormous, and in some ways worthy tribute for his work, but you can only see it as really a liberation technology if you smooth an enormous amount of stuff out of the system. Another, again, from someone that you might know, a student of mine, Rajesh, who is just finishing up his dissertation, looking at the politics of openness and surveillance. He's looking at, again, at right to information laws. He's looking also at the NREGA in India. He's looking in the state of Andhra, which became the model in many ways for how right to information laws should be implemented, how the NREGA, which was the major Employment Guarantee Act, how it was susceptible to corruption, and how we could use technology for transparency and openness to prevent that corruption. And in particular, giving the upper bureaucracy ability to see the lower bureaucrats who were seen as, in many ways, the source of corruption, so their behavior could be monitored. Because one of the things he realized is that along with transparency, and almost occasionally in a symbiotic relationship with it, comes surveillance, and how you keep those two in balance. And one of the things that he was particularly interested in was the idea that you could have, and I'm sure again you've heard of this, and I do think it's admirable, a lot of public meetings in which people could come and see, for instance, how much they had been credited with being paid, and reveal whether they really had received that money or whether it had got lost in a scheme of one sort or another to hide it. But he was interested to find that participation in those meetings, the idea that if we have the technology which will sell a public sphere, so many of these problems will be solved, people didn't participate in those meetings in anywhere like the rates that he assumed you would. This is your chance to go and make the system equitable. What he discovered, of course, is that if it is in part a surveillance system, and if in some ways there's a corruption in the system, and if people at the bottom, not because they're inherently corrupt, but because they are inherently in the system, are implicated in one way or another in that corruption, then their ability and their willingness and their freedom to stand up and talk suddenly changes fairly interestingly and dramatically. So again, the idea that technology would save the situation and that information would be liberated had to come up a great deal of other more complex issues. And then another, just finally, the last one that I want to mention is the idea again of the public sphere. This is by an undergraduate in computer science, comes from Brazil, and has been looking at the tribal communities trying to fight off people taking over their land, which has been a huge problem in parts of Brazil. And of course, a lot of enthusiasts went to help the people in the tribes, and they said, look, we can get the word out. We now have Twitter, we now have Facebook, we now have all these other ways in which your side of the story can be told. But what he found was quick over time that, of course, that voice was drowned out. That it wasn't hard for the government and countervailing very wealthy parties simply to create much, much greater presence on the net, so that the voice that was meant to be heard was drowned out very quickly. But again, we can say to them, look, you can speak up. If you're not being heard, it's your fault. And here I brought in a slightly depressing phrase. I'll use a few of them from Norbert Wiener in Cybernetics, who said that the hope that the good of a better understanding anticipate and outweigh the incidental contribution we are making to the concentration of power is a very slight hope. That when we go in and say, look, we can give you this technology, put you in this touch, and what we're going to do is disrupt the balance of power, the worrying thing is what we do is actually, going back to Paul Willis and learning to labor, is if we're naive about it, we actually consolidate the balance of power, even though our intentions are the very best of contentions. So Here again, I'm not very good at coming up with solutions. Just a quick question, the great Leninist question, what is to be done, is usually asked at some point. And as I'm drawing to a close, let me, again, to point to another student of mine, I think that one of the interesting things that we have to do is actually start to go out and look on the ground at how things are implemented, rather than simply assume or wish on the technology or make the grand Negroponte statements, or even look from a safe distance, because the situations into which we are introducing technology are usually enormously more problematic than we ever know. I draw attention to Ashwin Matthew, who's recently taken his doctorate from Berkeley, a wonderful dissertation called Where in the World is the Internet? Because we have two versions of the internet in a way. One is it's kind of our local stuff, and one is it's just this large global infrastructure. One is, to some extent, put us in prey to local corporations, but that's kept at bay by this non-corporate superstructure. Now, Ashwin's argument in many ways is that that superstructure is held together by a few very dedicated technologists who are really both fending off governments and fending off corporations to keep the simple exchange of the different networks in open distributed balance without interference either from governments or corporations. Very few people really know about the sort of work that goes on at somewhere like Nenog, where all these people get together. Very few really realize, I think, the pressure that they are under, whether it be from governments or from corporations, to turn the system in very different ways. So we idealize the system because we don't really have a close look at what's going on. And when we try to think, well, how can we save it? What are the laws that we should introduce? If we don't understand the structure, then those laws themselves are as likely to be damaging as they are useful. Talking about laws, then, just very quickly, let me offer a couple more laws, which I think in this context, just in general, to throw out in contrast to one another. One is one in an investigation I did of open source peer production. I called Graham's law after Paul Graham, who said, the method of ensuring quality in peer production is Darwinian. People just produce whatever they want, the good stuff spreads, and the bad gets ignored. I call it Graham's law because Gresham's law is the one that, of course, everything gets debased over time. This is the reverse. No, we just head to nirvana. All we have to do is produce as we see fit, and the world will be automatically healed. And I think that is a supposition that goes very easily with ideas of liberation technology if we're naive about them. And the difficult thing is it also can be very difficult to criticize. I was using this to criticize some aspects of peer production. And of course, because peer production is for the most part voluntary and done out of goodwill, it seems really mean-spirited to do that. And it feels a little like going to the local church bake sale and criticizing the quality of the cakes that are on offer. You know, this is meant to be a generous, spirited, charitable event, but that's the trouble. And so in many ways they get away with being seen as these philanthropic virtues which are above criticism. Another law I think that is important in this world, which some of you may know, has led me to think about a lot of it, is Goodhart's law. Goodhart, actually, I think I might have misspelled that. That may be A-R-T, Goodhart, yes, sorry. Who is a governor of the Bank of England, and during the major period of inflation in the 1970s, was looking at the way they were producing statistics, the sort of stuff that we think of as big data, and that we often rely upon. Particularly something like economic statistics, which we think, people, it's just indifferent to the people, it just rises and we can track them. And with big data, we see in that some way in which we can validate our own work and say, look out there, the figures are just showing us that this is fine. But Goodhart makes the important point that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed on it for control. That is, once people see that their behavior is being judged by these figures, they will find ways to fake and change and make those figures work to their advantage. So the idea that we can simply stand back and have a distant and objective view through things like data surveys becomes very problematic, because the minute people know that's how they're being judged, that data will start to be corrupted. So let me very quickly draw to a close, not necessarily a particularly cheerful one, and I apologize if I've spread gloom in the room. Not that this is something that everybody is doing, but these are things we have to be aware of. Here is a particularly cheerful line. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded. And that's the sort of enthusiasm that we can suddenly find people talking to us with and get our heart beating. That line actually comes from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It is produced by Kurtz, the person that Marlon Brando plays in the film Apocalypse Now, who in fact is both the image of and the agent of the corruption of empire. He is the figure that comes out from England, basically writes this pamphlet about how much colonialism can do for the heart of Africa, and slowly gets both corrupted and is the source of all the horror that comes in that story. So simple goodwill, I want to say, is not enough. Put it in some ways in a gloomier perspective, I want to draw on Norbert Wiener again, who, looking again at a new science of cybernetics, which he saw as the means of control, and he was a great enthusiast and optimist in some way, and said, we can control people and we can control them for good. But in cybernetics, he suddenly gets a little cautious, and he says, those of us who've contributed to the new science of cybernetics stand in a moral position. That's one of the things that I feel many technologists need to learn, which is to say the least not very comfortable. So he's not smug about it. We're dealing with people totally unprepared to enter into the larger political, technological, sociological, and economic questions which concern the very existence of labor. Here, because he's partly talking about machines which may replace people, a theme that we have today. So he says, it stands in a moral position not very comfortable. It's a new science which embraces technical developments with great possibilities for good and evil. We can only hand it over into the world that exists, the world of Belsen and Hiroshima. Because here's a man writing after the war, straight after the war. So he's full of enthusiasm. He is one of the great fathers of the modern information society, but he equally sees there is no reason, there is nothing inherent in the technology that will produce good. And given the circumstances in which it's produced, it might well not. So, finally, my own vindication, having taken you back into the part, that he goes on to say there is much we must leave, whether we like it or not, to the unscientific, that's me, the narrative method of the professional historian. So he wants to say we fall outside. And so his final line, which I thought, well, let's look in historically. Well, let's think of the great line for the medical profession. It goes back to Greek society. First, do no harm. And I thought, well, let's end on that. That at least should be over. And I thought, yeah, well, of course, isn't it interesting that that was turned into do no evil? And of course, you raise the bar so much higher when it says it has to count as evil before you think twice about doing it. So let's bring that bar down and think about first, do no harm. Thanks very much.